Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we'll be focusing on a recent book by Mia Bay entitled Traveling Black, The Story of Race and Resistance, published in March of this year by Harvard University Press. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center, who is not with us today. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. For over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly, usually if not always on Mondays in pre-COVID time in person at the Wilson Center, and since pandemic restrictions, here in the virtual realm. We have a continuing lineup of sessions ahead of us this season that will carry us into late December. We hope you can join us for many of those. Please note, today's session has closed captioning enabled, and you can activate it on your Zoom screen. Behind the scenes are two people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And I'd like to thank an institutional supporter, the George Washington University Department of History, as well as our individual donors, anonymous and not anonymous. As always, we invite you to join their ranks. And on the logistics front, please note that today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of this webinar, we ask those of you to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. Those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to Rachel Wheatley, whose email address will appear in the chat function, and we'll call on as many folks as we can. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our author today, Mia Bay, who is the Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols Professor of American History at the University of Pennsylvania. She's a scholar of American and African-American intellectual, cultural, and social history, whose publications include The White Image and the Black Mind, African-American Ideas About White People, 1830 to 1925, published by Oxford University Press in 2000, To Tell the Truth Freely, The Life of Ida B. Wells, Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, 2009, and now Traveling Black, A Story of Race and Resistance, Harvard University Press, 2021. The book she will be talking about this afternoon. Mia, the Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Arneson, and thank you for my commentators. Thanks in advance on your comments. I'm happy to kind of give an overview of this book to get us started. Traveling Black is a history of the experiences of African-American travelers on various forms of segregated transportation, from the antebellum era, when you had things like stagecoaches and steamships, on through to the present day. It kind of charts the desegregation of some of the best known forms of segregated transportation, such as the abolition of the Jim Crow car. And it also ends with some consideration about modern day transportation inequities. I became interested in this book because I became kind of fascinated by the complex way in which travel segregation developed. Historians still debate exactly when the South became and how and why the South became segregated and became this world of Jim Crow cars and sitting at the back of the bus. But travel was clearly very central in it. As I kind of observed how especially segregation on the railroad was really sort of central to the development of transportation segregation and figures prominently in the most sort of famous segregation landmarks, such as the Plessy versus Ferguson case, I began to realize that we didn't really have much of a sense of how segregation moved from one form of technology to another, or sort of the specifics of how you segregate people in a sort of world in which you move from trains to buses to airplanes. So I set out to write this book to kind of answer some of those questions. And what I do in the book is I answer them on the various forms of transportation. It's a book that very much follows people on their journeys. And one of the reasons I was able to write it was that the experience of traveling Jim Crow or in the back of the bus or in some other kind of inferior accommodation was something that large numbers of Black people were just enraged, humiliated, often frightened by. It's something that you almost any prominent Black leader you can think of at some point addresses the issue of the Jim Crow car or various forms of travel segregation. And then of course, ordinary people have that. So it's something that once I began looking, I could see evidence everywhere. It was, Black newspapers, people's writings, people kind of describe these journeys. So I began to try to track their journeys, and I tracked their journeys through various chapters that look at these different forms of transportation. And it reveals a world that we don't think about that often, in the sense that we don't spend that much time thinking about how people get from place to place. But of course, travel is sort of a sort of fundamental experience that most of us are even familiar with today. It puts us kind of outside of our comfort zone. We're going places we don't know. And in the case of Black travelers, you see Black travelers experiencing new forms of transportation, new forms of segregation, kind of struggling through that. And a couple of insights I would suggest from the book is travel segregation is really almost as old as common carriers, which is to say forms of transportation other than private wagons like stagecoaches and steamships. It takes shape in the early 19th century, which is also an era in which you begin to have the abolition of slavery and you first get segregation in the North. And from the very beginning, with the abolition of slavery, Black freedom is something that unnerves whites. It also puts pressure on whites to try to develop new ways to maintain a kind of racial hierarchy. Travel is also closely linked with class. So among the travelers who made whites especially nervous were these sort of middle-class travelers who could afford to ride in the most comfortable seats in stagecoaches or in the first class cars on railroads. And they were one of the targets of various forms of travel segregation. Other key points about travel segregation is that we are now perhaps far enough removed from some forms of Jim Crow that people can imagine that separate but equal involve some sort of parallel system of accommodations. But one of the key characteristics of the travel segregation experienced by Blacks is that the kinds of travel facilities that Blacks had to endure were almost invariably deeply inferior. The Jim Crow car on the train, which was a small portion of the train, it was often an old, dirty, and sometimes dangerous car, became, for many African Americans, a kind of metaphor for discrimination itself, because it was so manifestly inferior and uncomfortable. And like I said, in some cases, dangerous, because over time, the Jim Crow cars were the oldest cars on trains and therefore much more likely to be damaged in the case of a train crash. Trains slowly moved from wooden cars to metal cars over the course of the early 20th century, creating trains in which the only wooden car on the train might be the Jim Crow car. The other thing is that segregation manages to move from one form of technology to each other. In each case, it requires regulation, it requires enforcement. The story of traveling Black is very much a story of race and resistance. So you see, in the case of each form of segregation, you see African Americans initially welcoming new forms of transportation, such as buses, cars, and airplanes, as new opportunities for freedom. And you also see the ways in which various forms of sort of racial injustice and racial hierarchy are inscribed on these forms. And then I would also add that the book kind of discusses things we don't always think about when we think about Jim Crow, such as cars and airplanes. Cars, of course, are private property, and they did offer Blacks certain kinds of freedoms from the humiliations of Jim Crow. But for all that cars are private property, cars traverse roads with hotels, gas stations, restaurants, and all of these establishments are crucial to driving, and many of them over the course of the 20th century would be segregated. They would be segregated by a travel industry that was often kind of catering to a white middle class that they believed did not welcome Blacks, did not want to sit beside Blacks, which underscores another point that comes across throughout the book, which is that while the South was the area with Jim Crow laws, the experience of travel segregation was often a national one. Entire categories of travel facilities like hotels were often segregated, not just in the South, but most parts of the Midwest, the West, the North. There were some civil rights laws north of the Mason-Dixon line that discouraged out and out segregation, but that did not mean that there was not a lot of informal segregation. So the book charts all these forms of segregation, including various forms of segregation on airplanes and in airports. And it also charts African-American resistance to it, which is in fact a kind of, I think, neglected central theme in civil rights activism. It's something that is sort of coming from the ground often. A lot of individuals take on Jim Crow in individual court cases, but it's also something that institutionally civil rights organizations such as the NAACP take on. And then when you get to the 60s, of course, the civil rights movement takes shape, at least in part, around resistance to segregation on buses. I think of the Freedom Rides, the Montgomery bus boycott. So it's a sort of continuing theme. So I don't want to overdo my time here, and I very much want to hear what my commentators have to say. So I think I'm going to open it up to discussion now.
Right. Thank you very much. Our first commentator this afternoon is Greta De Young, who completed her PhD degree in history at Penn State University, and she's Foundation Professor of History at the University of Nevada in Reno. She's the author of A Different Day, African-American Struggles for Justice in Rural Louisiana, 1900 to 1970, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2002, Invisible Enemy, The African-American Freedom Struggle After 1965, published by Wiley Blackwell in 2010, and You Can't Eat Freedom, Southerners and Social Justice After the Civil Rights Movement, UNC Press, 2016. Greta, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you, Eric, for that introduction, and thank you to the Washington History Seminar for inviting me to comment on this wonderful book by Mia Bay. It's really an outstanding study of racial discrimination and transportation that places Black Americans' assertions of their right to mobility at the center of the freedom struggle. Dr. Bay mines a huge array of newspaper accounts and archival sources to provide a rich analysis of the difficulties faced by Black travelers across centuries of American history and all forms of public accommodations, from stagecoaches to Airbnb. In the process, she reminds us of the devastating effects that segregation and exclusion had on African Americans of all social classes. She highlights the systemic nature of racism and the power of the law in shaping Black experiences. And she reveals the constant and varied forms of resistance that Black people mounted against the dehumanizing treatment that they endured while traveling. I think a real key strength of this book is its use of hundreds of personal accounts of Black travelers to demonstrate the concrete realities of racism and its effects on African Americans. One story that really struck me was toward the end of the final chapter. Dr. Bay tells us about the revelation that President Lyndon Johnson had after hearing details of the hardships that his Black employees faced on the road. And like millions of other white Americans, Johnson knew that racial discrimination existed, but as Dr. Bay notes, he had not thought through what it meant in the daily lives of Black people. And this book helps us to think it through. We learn what it's like to live with constant uncertainty and fear of racial slights, ranging from humiliation to lynching. We see how the placement of decrepit and unsafe Jim Crow train cars at the front of trains devalued Black lives by forcing African Americans to bear a greater risk of injury or death in the event of a crash. We gain insight into the violence of the nation's racial system, not just through blatant acts of injustice like the beatings and murders of people who resisted segregation, but also in the physical pain and stress suffered by Black travelers who were denied access to food, shelter, and other amenities on long journeys. We learn how racism operates as a system of wealth extraction, affecting African Americans of all social classes. The wealthy travelers who were forced to travel Jim Crow despite having paid for first-class tickets, or who got bumped from flights to make room for white passengers. Also the sharecroppers who were discouraged from buying cars that would enhance their employment opportunities and make it harder for landlords to cheat them out of their earnings. And African Americans of all backgrounds who still routinely pay more for cars and auto insurance than white Americans with identical incomes. Dr. Bay demonstrates clearly that racism is systemic. It's built into law and policy and corporate practices. It's not just an expression of individual prejudice. And throughout the book, we see changes in the law were central to shaping Black travel experiences, from the protections for civil rights passed during the Reconstruction era, to the Supreme Court's negation of those rights in the civil rights cases in Plessy versus Ferguson, to landmark civil rights cases such as Morgan versus Virginia, which struck early blows against state segregation laws in the decades leading up to Brown versus Board of Education and the Montgomery bus boycott. As civil rights scholars, we're used to thinking of the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution as being like the most important legal mechanisms for advancing Black equality. But Dr. Bay rightly highlights laws governing interstate commerce and the federal government's power to regulate that as playing an equally important role. As I was reading, it seemed to me that the Interstate Commerce Commission served a similar function as the Justice Department, just by being a place to lodge complaints of discrimination and build a case for federal intervention. Her analysis also shows that merely passing laws banning discrimination is never enough to ensure racial equality, because laws are meaningless unless they're enforced. And too often racist practices continued even after they were outlawed by the courts. As in so many areas, Black people themselves did the hard work of making sure that rights that existed on paper were translated into practice. Resistance to travel discrimination was constant and took a wide array of forms, ranging from individual acts of defiance to lawsuits, to the mass protests and direct action against segregation associated with the modern civil rights movement. And as Dr. Bay points out, that movement was a culmination rather than a beginning in the fight against racist practices in the transportation and travel industries. Segregated stagecoaches, streetcars, train cars, and buses were all contested spaces throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. And African Americans developed ways to navigate around Jim Crow by packing their own food and other supplies when traveling, and sharing information and publishing travel guides that identified Black-friendly businesses, and using white allies to gain access to racially exclusive spaces and services. And when new technologies like car and air travel raised hopes of liberation, and then later gave rise to new forms of discrimination, Black people fought against those as well. Sustained pressure on all of these fronts, combined with the federal government's renewed interest in racial justice during the Cold War, finally secured passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and shifts in law and policy and enforcement that ended travel segregation. But as anyone who studies African American history knows, progress toward racial equality is not linear, and rights can never be taken for granted. As Malcolm X likes to say, racism is like a Cadillac. They bring out a new model every year. And Dr. Bay recognizes this in her conclusion, which describes persistent discrimination encountered by Black drivers and travelers today. If this book is any guide, and I'm certain that it is, we can be sure that as we move further into the 21st century, racism and resistance to it will take new forms, requiring all of us to continue the struggle for justice. So a couple of questions I have, and I think I'm supposed to ask them now and engage with Dr. Bay a little bit. So one question I have concerns the fluidity of racial practices, and I think you mentioned this a little bit in your overview, but at various points in history we have this fluidity in practice, and then it's solidified into more rigid and segregated practices. So in the late 19th century, we see a period of progress toward racial equality turned back by the rise of Jim Crow, and then new forms of technology arise, put things in flux for a while, and then new forms of discrimination emerge and racial hierarchies are put back into place. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and how your research provides insight into specific factors that might push things in one direction or another, either toward fluidity and equality or toward more rigid forms of racism and segregation. And then a second question, I'm really interested in the role that travel discrimination might have played in limiting employment opportunities for African Americans, and whether you saw evidence that it discouraged people from going into occupations like sales or technical support or positions that required them to travel a lot.
Mia, do you want to tackle those or?
Sure, I will do my best. The fluidity of practices is a great question, and it is something that I sort of wrestled with throughout, because you do see it, and there's also a lot of fluidity of practices from one state to another, some of which you could actually write in state by state history of travel segregation. But sometimes it had to do with very practical things like the segregation of streetcars, which is not a major part of my book because I'm mostly looking at long distance travel, but still the segregation of streetcars takes a long time and sort of progresses in fits and starts, because you actually had to, there was the priority of getting people to work. There was also the possibility of municipal streetcar strikes. There was a wave of them. So sometimes there were sort of practical things that made segregation difficult. Oftentimes it did seem like the laws, when they came down, were not a reflection of accepted practice, but rather a reflection of the fact that African Americans were insisting on using first class accommodations. To give just one example, Texas, when it did its first bus commission, somehow forgot to write segregation into the law. And within weeks, there was a Black woman insisting on riding at the front of the bus, and they had to revise. So the fluidity sometimes came out of just the sort of sheer complexity of keeping up with the moving target. And it sometimes remained in place because it served a certain purpose, but the sort of imposition of travel segregation and the maintenance of the kind of strict travel segregation was often a sort of political goal that politicians mobilized around. That's one reason you see it sort of occurring when it does in the 1880s and 90s, as the South is being redeemed for white supremacy. You begin to have it, and then it's sort of maintained as a sort of measure of that for many, many years. So it's sort of a balance between what's in fact a very impractical system that is difficult for even the carriers to maintain versus sort of regional commitments. And I think those are things that are kind of pushing it in different directions. And in some cases, they're never resolved, like with the Pullman accommodations, this sort of extra accommodations such as sleeping cars, special seats that you could buy through the Pullman company, were never formally segregated, but the company would go along with informal practices on the ground, and you got a lot of fluidity there. Your second question about travel discrimination and how it affected people's work opportunities is a great one. And in many ways, I wish I had better answers. One of the things that really struck me in writing this book was that people prevailed over incredible travel difficulties to do things like participate in the Great Migration and then, send their children home. So as much as people hated it, people seem to have overcome. But I think that especially if you went down on a kind of granular level, you would find certain things that certain kinds of work and certain kind of particular commutes that people found very discouraging due to travel segregation. There's particularly a lot of complaints around people who had jobs that, let's say, require them to move across state lines in areas right where that's a shift. So to move from Ohio into the segregated states, people would it would add a level of difficulty to move through the DC area that I think sometimes made certain kinds of work really difficult, especially if you had to travel those routes frequently.
Thank you very much. Our next commentator is Sage Matthew, an associate professor of history at the University of Minnesota. She has been a fellow at the Charles Warren Center and the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard University, the Center for American Studies at the University of Heidelberg, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. She earned a joint PhD in history and African American studies from Yale University, and she specializes in 20th century American and African American history, looking at immigration, war, globalization, social movements, and political resistance. She is the author of North of the Color Line, Migration and Black Resistance in Canada, 1870 to 1955, published in 2010 by the University of North Carolina Press, and the forthcoming The Glory of Their Deeds, A Global History of Black Soldiers and the Great War. Sage, the Zoom room is yours.
So I want to start off by saying that this is a book that I think a lot of people should feel this way when they get to the end of the book, and that is to say, where have you been my whole life? I think that was my reaction. Transportation, I think the book mounts a very compelling case for looking to transportation as a site of pitchfork battles over Jim Crow throughout what has come to be known as the long civil rights movement. So I always teach my students that there were these sort of, pretty reliable pillars of Reconstruction thinking and political activism. And we can follow those threads from the moment those rights are lost until yesterday or this after, an hour ago, right? And I think that this book does that for transportation in a way that I haven't seen elsewhere. I think in terms of the book's organization, it works wonderfully for a graduate course because it's muscular and makes you think, and sort of brings together so many different fields that oftentimes are not in communication with each other. But it's also very accessible for undergraduates, for grad students, for people who are absolutely new to this field. So a book that has the ability to touch such a broad audience is one that we all know as scholars is incredibly hard to write. And that a book that does that so well is also pretty rare. So to that end, I really enjoyed my time with this book. I think that Dr. Bay is really asking us to think about roads and other networks of transportation as that they should be understood as vectors of violence for African Americans, right? Spiritually and actually. We see example after example across many different forms of transportation, ways in which African Americans experience, death by a million little cuts, right? And then really dangerous encounters on roads, be they back roads that African Americans feel they have to take because that's safer than the major highways, which is really hard for me to imagine as a woman, right? Like I want to stay on it has to start with an I, right? Instead of where I am now in the Midwest, where there's country road after tiny country road. My daughter and I drove through Montana on our way to the Canadian Rockies last December. And there were many times when I was like, I don't like that this road has no gas station, no lights. It's going through mountains that I don't know where it will end, et cetera. So like the idea that I think in reading this book, you have to change how you think about roads. And I think that for some people, perhaps as women, perhaps as immigrants, perhaps as tourists, you navigate those spaces very differently. And here again, Bay does a good job of showing us how for diplomats, especially after World War II, this constant sort of friction, right? The way in which they buttress Jim Crow becomes not only very problematic among Black people moving around this country, but in bigger ways against the background of the Cold War. So I think that the book asks us to really consider how mobility, right, disrupts racial assumptions about belonging, about place, about class, about gender, about regions, right? Like the idea that before, again, moving to this part of the country, I'm in a Minneapolis suburb, I would not have really thought about making a massive detour through Iowa, Nebraska, et cetera, to get to California. But African Americans did this all the time in order to circumvent going through the South. And I first came across that when I was looking at the Green Book, and I kept finding little references to a hotel that would be okay in the middle of North Dakota or a gas station that would be useful there. And that's when I first sort of thought about these vectors, and then the book connects those dots in a way that I think are really fantastic. So I think for me, the strength of this book is it reminds us that mobility is a transgressive act. It disrupts like even how we understand whose people's race, what race people are, right? So you have these wonderful examples in the book of conductors or ticket agents asking, or phone operators needing the passengers to confirm their race before they're even willing to sell them a ticket, right? And then making those decisions based on what they think race sounds like or what race looks like. And so when you have a period of hypermobility and African Americans want to be a part of that, it in and of itself becomes a problematic, right? A transgressive act. God, there's just so much I want to say about this book, but I want to focus on two things that, maybe three. So the first is that we see in this book that modernization is very much linked for the South to transportation. Their ability to say that they have these, railway networks that connect people, that they've mastered these technologies, that they can offer the same level of quality service for that dollar, that they can provide a first-class service. That becomes a way of reconnecting or soothing over the tensions between North and South. And we see that, right, by the way that companies that don't even have a requirement to Jim Crow their services choose to do that in order to appease would-be Southern passengers, and to do that over the objections of African Americans who were willing to pay exorbitant rates to maintain their sense of place, right? So I think that we should, if we think about the work that transportation does for stitching back the country together, we get this much more complicated Gordian knot happening when we look at trains and streetcars and cars themselves, and ways in which African Americans tried to constantly find a path for themselves. And so I think this book, for example, pairs really nicely with Melissa Milewski's, if I'm saying that correctly, Litigating Across the Color Line, because she shows how African Americans had already been suing for damages in other ways. So we shouldn't be surprised that they are doing so also in other forms of transportation. It also works wonderfully with Sarah Seo's policing the open road, and she shows us how from the very beginning we're criminalizing Blackness and movement because of these transportation networks. I'm running out of time, so I want to say two quick things and throw them out there. They're not actual questions, but they're things that I would have loved to see more. And I acknowledge in saying that that's my problem, not the authors, right? Because we always it's such an easy complaint, but my response to that is write your own book, enjoy, right? I think that Bay does such an amazing job in her first chapter at including gender and the battle over railway transportation. And when I got to the next chapter, which I think was about streetcars, I was waiting to see it there, and it almost seemed to disappear. And then it comes back again in other chapters, but in a way, I wanted that thread to stay really thick throughout the whole book. And this is where my own sort of interests come in. And I was thinking about, I taught a course on America's love affair with cars. And one of the things that surprised me with cars is how early on women being in cars was considered a crime, right? That they were called pimp mobiles because people were sure that women were using cars for commercial sex work, that they were using cars to meet up with other women for what seemed like transgressive sex at the time. And I really wondered about how Black women who had been so smart about using trains and their gender to force a place for themselves might have done so with cars, given how dangerous it was to be out on the road, right? And what we see in every single chapter, in a way that I hadn't realized before, is how much women are at the forefront of the legal cases over each of these forms of transportation, right? And so again, I was sort of hoping I wanted to hear more about those women, and I know that Professor Bay knows this, but we've all been in the position where we had to forfeit something in order to get to the printer. The last thing I want to say is about leisure and how that connects with cars, right? And how transgressive it is again with movement. So I was waiting to hear. I wanted to know more about youth culture and the use of cars in transgressive ways, right? So when Muhammad Ali says he wants a cherry red Cadillac after beating Liston, right? When you see I'm forgetting what they're called right now, the low riders in California, right? It's about young people saying, you cannot ignore me, right? You must see me. And that's a part of the ways in which African Americans force themselves into a space through mobility. And there's just so much that can be done there. So I hope that this work inspires people to have fun with the possibilities of looking at transportation as this thing that's in our lives and that we don't even think about all that often, but that little decisions like turning a key, or as the rapper Lil Baby tells us, right? His transgressive act is brand new car got no keys, right? So that's the measure now of class, that you have to be that you have to have the most expensive car as a way of making yourself seen, and that's an act in and of itself. I think my last statement, as I'm sure I'm running out of time here, my last statement is again exposes my bias and interest, and that's World War I. In 1898, the car ownership was one car for every 18,000 people in the United States. But in 1913, that ratio goes from 1 to 18. And so I wasn't surprised to see that in those years around World War I, we get the cases in streetcars, buses, trains, and cars all at the same time, because the war itself sort of sets people moving, right? By all of those forms of transportation. So they have money in their pockets, they're able to move for work. And so I wasn't surprised to see just how many clashes, right? Along gender lines, along class, are all happening around that time. And I think, again, great area for people to mine in future. So I loved this book. I wish I've already, like you, Eric, I've already mentioned it to students. And I think that is going to be repeated over and over and over again. So thank you for this great read.
Thank you. Mia?
Thank you for your comments, Sage. And I'm totally with you on all the things that got left out. I mean, I did feel like I could continue working on this book forever. It could get impossibly large. There were many things where, I don't know, sometimes you write books where you use every source you have, and other times you write these books where I was like, there's many very interesting things that I'm not actually even mentioning. But I wanted to kind of put it together, and I agree that the gender thread could be thicker. I mean, when I think of this book, and I hopefully it comes across in the overall narrative, but I would say that one of the things you see in Traveling Black is the development of a kind of consumer culture around travel that has as its ideal traveler a sort of white woman. So there's often, like so much of what we encounter when we travel, from gas stations with little cottagey buildings to like curtains on, planes, are very domestic, living roomy, and they're kind of these white women spaces that were often unfriendly to Blacks. And the gender politics on travel were always complicated. As you mentioned, women are frequently in the forefront of cases. And I don't know that I really argued this consistently in the book, but I do think one of the reasons is that men actually, when they did defy white conductors or bus drivers, they often got physical injury. The court case was harder to take. The consequences could actually be lethal. So you have both men and women, men making very considered decisions about that. And in some forms of transportation, you have men just avoiding them. I mean, like, for instance, in the example of the Montgomery bus boycott, from what I understand, men in Montgomery had stopped riding those buses because of the same kind of conflicts that led Rosa Parks to take her stand. So you have a sort of gender difference around whether you can sort of safely get it to a court, which I think is one reason why women end up so central in these cases. But I think you're right that there are certainly stories. I mean, one could write an entire book on just Black women in cars. I saw a lot of evidence of men encouraging women to own and drive cars as an alternative, but you also had Black men who would kind of drive their wives or daughters places. There was some sense that cars were better, but then once again, when you're out on the road, you had to worry about women in cars. And you have a lot of early women drivers like Zora Neale Hurston, who made one of her backers buy her a car. So there's all sorts of stories there, and I wish I had time to do more of them. And I think they underscore that there's a sort of profound gender dimension to this all, to the whole experience of travel and race, which I definitely could be thicker. Likewise, youth culture and leisure transportation, again, a kind of endless subject, as is kind of this whole thing about cars, because I do mention in the book a lot of times that there is a kind of formula in the South for people who don't want to get in conflicts with whites who may be hostile to Blacks who own expensive cars. There's some idea that African Americans should buy Fords, should buy older cars, should kind of avoid drawing attention. But there are also plenty of African Americans who defied that, from Jack Johnson, who owned 5 cars, including some canary yellow roadster, to jazz musicians who drove through the Midwest in Rolls Royces. Like, it could also just be a thumb in the eye to white discrimination. And it was something that African Americans made their own choices about. And there's also a really interesting and vibrant African-American car culture that develops around, the sort of you are what you drive, but also around, the fact that Blacks are often kind of, because they meet discrimination in white-owned filling stations and garages. There's a Black collar culture develops that includes a lot of auto mechanics, people who maybe got their training as chauffeurs, and this further kind of creates a sort of love of cars and a love of particular types of cars, which again, I think you could write an entire book about. And I've seen some interesting things too on Black motorcyclists. Oh. And of course, the lowriders is a story in itself. World War I is also something I quite consciously would have loved to talk about more in the book. It comes like in the middle of like just an amazingly complex moment in the history of transportation. And it unleashes conflicts over transportation that you see again in World War II. So I didn't even go into it as much as I could because there were so many things to deal with. But I think it is a fascinating time period where you see these kind of conflicts on the ground. You see the first generation of Black car buying, as well as all the kind of clashes between whites and Blacks on the road, and the sort of creation of a new sort of transportation culture. I think it is just a fascinating time for traveling Black. And it's also a time that underscores, as World War II will also do, that travel is going to be an issue, that African Americans are going to travel. Sometimes in kind of doing the research for this book, I came across people kind of talking about how, well, we don't have a lot of scholarship on Black travelers because Black people don't travel much. They don't go on vacation, whatever. But it's like the Great Migration. People are on, the war, people are on the road pretty much continuously throughout the first half of the 20th century. And that's the lived experience you have to appreciate. And with African Americans, it both acquaints them with travel segregation, but it also acquaints them with a world in which the sort of rules by which they might have grown up do not prevail everywhere, which I think also encourages people to think about resistance, think about reshaping that world.
And I also, again, like you've just proven that volume 2 right? But I also kept thinking about my own experience as a child. Like, I'm Canadian, and whenever we'd come to the US as a family, there was all this stuff that became real about when we crossed the border, right? Like, once we got an Entenmann pound cake, like, then we knew we were in the US because that wasn't available in Canada. But then when we were going back into Canada, my parents would always have this level of anxiety about crossing that border. And we had to sort of behave in the car and answer with one-word answers. And again, like, that made me, in reading this book, it made me think about the next borders, right? Or traveling to Mexico, like when you're talking about how African Americans towards the end of the book are vilified going up I-95 and Route 40 because they're presumed, and West Indians, they're presumed to be drug dealers. It added that layer that reminds the reader that not all Black people here are Americans. And so they too, sort of clash. They bump into things as a result of this infrastructure. And I think it's just, there's so much to mine here. And the beauty and the difficulty of this book is that it is rich, it is dense, it is a dense bite, but it remains accessible on every page. And again, that's not an easy pitch. So that's really impressive. So
Thank you for that.
Oh, one last thing, I was hoping it would come up, the shoebox lunches.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because like that.
Oh, totally.
African Americans would develop an entire culinary tradition, really, around, like, there are now restaurants that cater to shoebox lunches, and these were healthy, wonderful meals that Black families packed because they couldn't trust that there would be a safe or healthy place to stop. And when you mentioned, for example, the bathrooms in Alabama where there weren't lights and it wasn't clean, there again, the gender question came up. It was like, you could get raped in there, you could get mugged in there, right? Men or women, and women have to use the bathroom together. That even that little action becomes a way, like that simple bodily need becomes, an opportunity for great violence and certainly humiliation and God knows what else, right? So yeah, food, all the traditions around transportation are really fantastic, and we forget that they're connected to these acts of resistance, right? Like I refuse to have to overpay for a terrible sandwich. I'm always like, one last thing, but this time I really, really promise it will be. When trying to explain to students who feel like, what's the big deal? Black people had to wait in a different room, right? A tiny room, or like it wasn't as comfortable as the white room. And then I say to them, and your book does a great job of reminding us, how do you feel when first class boards first when you're on a flight? And why do we feel like, why are we not enraged about that? That we just sort of like wait and watch this parade. And I think that that's the way in which you remind us that white people all over the country felt perfectly entitled to board first. And whatever discomforts that meant for other travelers, it wasn't even pernicious. It just didn't even occur to them. Just like we who board first, don't give it that much thought until we're not allowed to board first. And then it's an outrage, right? So I found that was a good way to connect it back to a contemporary lived experience. So
Yeah. Well, speaking of that lived experience, I'm very much struck every time I fly, which of course in the current pandemic is not as often as I used to, but it also underscores something that comes up in the book. America has such a sense of itself as a democracy, but travel is an extremely classed day-to-day experience. So I, who do not travel first class, I'm always in group 6, group 8, or group, where it's just like, okay, everyone knows I didn't pay a lot for that ticket. And, so it's, a lot of the ongoing travel problems that Black people encounter are due to this, due to this sort of ways in which our travel is still very much class, still very much about accessibility and money. And we tend to see people in terms of what they can afford. But the other thing, I'm glad you brought up the shoebox lunches, which a number of people have been bringing up. And of course, they're so central to Black travel, and also something that a lot of people have these kind of vivid, sometimes embarrassed memories getting on the train with the huge shoebox, which was, of course, all about having enough food for the long journey. But it was also about something else, which, a longer book might have emphasized, where there were moments in traveling where there was sort of the experience of what I think George Lipsitz called segregation as congregation, where in the Jim Crow car, you brought a big shoebox full of fried chicken and some other things, and you shared it with other people who didn't have a shoebox. Some soldiers who traveled during the Second World War and probably in the first talked about, like I would get on the train and I would look for a lady with a big shoebox and sit beside her. And then I'd have, then I'd eat well on my travels. And, this was kind of.
But it also felt like home in a place where you were supposed to feel like you had no place.
Right. Yeah. And the Jim Crow car often was a little bit preferable to the bus because it created a bit of a separate space where whites did not intrude to the same degree. And you had people sort of trying to make it their own place.
Thank you. I will just add some of the things you've been describing. You have a phrase at the beginning of the book, the unavoidable indignities of traveling Black. And it's not just a phrase. And when teaching students and you talk about separate waiting rooms or the signs, white, colored, whatever, to simply say separate is and unequal doesn't capture what you capture in such vivid detail for each mode of transportation. So if anyone has any doubt, reading this will just underscore the kind of granularity, just the nature of the indignity and the suffering that this imposes, on African American travelers. So it's a very, very vivid book. We're now moving to our question and answer period. There are a number.
Important, the determination of white people to maintain those little tropes of indignity, right? So how they change the language on the signs, etc. Like they won't let go.
And the book has countless such examples. For the question and answer session, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of ways you can participate. If you use the raise hand function, we can call on you. And when we call on you, unmute yourself and you can pose the question directly to our author and panelists. You can also use the question and answer function on Zoom, in which case I get to read the question. And for those of you on Facebook Live, you can email Rachel Wheatley, R-Wheatley, R-W-H-E-A-T-L-E-Y @historians.org, and I get conveyed the question. So we have a number of people in the queue. John Martin has been leading that pack. His hand has been up. John, we'll call on you. Please unmute yourself and pose your question.
Thank you, Eric. This sounds like a marvelous book. It's thoughtful, it's deep, and it's also real. And I'm wondering, did you come across any accounts of whites who resisted this, who stepped up and defended the rights of blacks to sit in a car, to go to the bathroom on the road, to do things that civilized people should be willing to do? I ask this because my wife's family grew up in Mississippi and would travel to Alabama with a family friend, my daughter's family friend, who was black. And my father-in-law would stand outside the restroom and insist that that child be able to use the restroom, even though there was always resistance. Are there other accounts of this in your book, or are we left without any whites who had the gumption to stand up and do something?
No, I definitely found evidence of whites who resisted, especially during the sort of period around the Second World War, when many whites were beginning to question segregation. And also First World War II, was white soldiers were not always pleased to see men in uniform of any color being segregated, so they would sometimes stand up for their fellow soldiers. When it came to resisting certain forms of segregation in the South, whites did have to worry about breaking local segregation laws because they could get caught in that. So you don't see that or don't hear about that much sort of day-to-day active resistance, though I think there are also whites who kind of ignore the segregation laws. That actually is something that makes the situation even more fluid for African Americans. They're never quite sure whether whites are going to police it or not police it. But there are, unfortunately, in many circumstances, whites whose job it is to police the segregation. That includes conductors on trains, bus drivers, many of which they were given police powers, and it was part of their job to enforce this. So this put whites in a complicated position when it came to resisting in the South, especially because of the laws.
Thank you. Michael Goodman has been waiting. That hand is up. Michael, if you would unmute yourself, you may ask a question.
Yeah, hello. My question would be this. When I was an undergraduate, in one of my history survey courses, we used the book The Strange Career of Jim Crow, which was a standard book on that subject back then. In that book, they indicated that generally airlines did not practice discrimination on board because of the difficulty, among other things, of determining where state lines lay from above and all that. So I guess my question is, since you mentioned that airlines did in fact practice segregation. I was wondering if you could go into more details about how was it practiced and how extensive was it? Thanks.
Okay, sure. The Strange Career of Jim Crow is a great book, and it was sort of a starting point for me thinking about this. I wasn't sure going in, whether one could write about segregation on planes, but I did find scattered evidence of various forms of segregation on planes. I can't say I know for sure how common it was at times, but I found complaints in the early days of flying that Black people were simply not being allowed to get on planes at all. Various journalists, musicians, other kind of early travelers reported being not even allowed to buy tickets. And then later, you actually do have the courts weighing in on airplanes definitely being common carriers. There's never any laws mandating segregation in the air because most airlines, virtually all airlines, travel interstate, so they cannot legally segregate. The Plessy versus Ferguson case, as people sometimes forget, really applies only to interstate transportation. But they do so anyway. There's a period of time when there are propeller planes with a sort of seat in the front that is not very popular because it's very near the propeller. Numerous Blacks report being seated in that plane, seated in that seat. And I actually found a letter from American Airlines explaining to someone who complained about it that this is where Black people sit on planes. Later, you would develop a system where African Americans, as planes were redesigned and there was no longer sort of one spectacularly bad seat, you developed a system where African Americans on planes were often given their own row. And this was done by reservations agents. If they knew the race of the passenger, would do that. Sometimes they would decide from their zip code or the sound of their voice, or sometimes people would get moved. So particularly during the wartime, there's these reports of an interracial group of soldiers getting on a plane and one of them being asked, the Black person being asked to move to a special row. This coincidentally is actually something my mother experienced. I once asked her what her first flight was like, and I thought she was going to talk about it being scary or majestic or something. And she was like, well, there were only 2 Black people on the plane, and I sat next to the other one, and I thought it was such a strange coincidence. Well, many years later, I researched it and found out it wasn't a coincidence. This is what they did when they had Black people on planes. So as Professor Matthew was saying, it shapes people's everyday experience, the segregation, in ways that sometimes they don't even always recognize.
I can't remember if it was, 60 Minutes, one of those types of shows very recently, within the last year. There were flight attendants talking about how they still used codes today, in the same way that they use codes to say who has babies. And I just want to clarify that when I referred to boarding first, I was talking about with a small child. And the way that people would get angry, right, at this sense of privilege that you have just because, and so there's that passive aggressive behavior, to be sure.
Stephen Shore had a very similar question about airlines, but your chapter actually does much more, and it explores the kind of the nature of air travel involving not just getting on an airplane, but being in a terminal, needing to eat in a terminal. You have these wonderfully vivid accounts of flights being diverted or canceled. So if you arrive in a city in the middle of the night, where do you stay? Could you talk a little bit about those unavoidable indignities of traveling Black in the air that the chapter captures so well?
Sure, I'd be glad to. One thing when you really begin to think about travel, both by car and by airplane, they are just so much more than the sum of the actual journey in the vehicle. When you travel by air, you often have to eat. If your plane gets delayed, you can be in the airport for a long time. And during early air travel, stopovers were really common, weather delays were really common. And this is sort of where air travel fell apart for many Black passengers. Segregation in the air, however common it was not that onerous. But what was onerous is to have your plane delayed overnight in an area where there was no Black hotel, and end up on a cot on somebody's porch, or or end up somewhere where the people are taking a bus for another portion of the journey, and you're not allowed on that bus. The kind of sort of basic things that made air travel work to get from door to door didn't necessarily work for Black travelers in a way that they found enormously frustrating. Sometimes a Black traveler would spend a lot of money to fly somewhere, arrive at the airport in their destination, and find out that cabs are segregated and there are no Black cabs coming to the airport. So they would have to get a Black cab summoned, and a couple of hours later they would get to their destination, having saved themselves very little time by flying. So these things were extremely frustrating, and they shaped the day-to-day experiences of Black travelers, and they compromised what was supposed to be a kind of, especially in the early days of flying, a luxury form of transportation, and kind of made it into something slow and uncertain and painful.
Just one quick follow-up on this. There is resistance that you describe, and I don't think that this is a major theme in the historiography, but how do you protest airline segregation? If you could just describe some of the ways in which, I guess, the protagonists or the actors in your book take on this particular industry, something that I think most of us don't know much about.
Well, and there was initially some idea that Blacks could actually have their own airlines. After the World War II, you have these Tuskegee pilots. They're hoping that they can start a Black airline. There is even a couple that try to get off the ground. So there's that form of resistance. Airlines are obviously capital intensive, and this was not going to happen. So what you have is people writing the heads of the airlines, pressing this issue, taking it to the NAACP, taking it to newspapers. One of the reasons I can even kind of reconstruct this story is people did their best to make a stink out of it. You also have a very sustained effort to desegregate the Washington National Airport in DC, which is segregated early on. It's actually technically in Virginia, and it's particularly odious because you have the nation's first early Black congressman going through this segregated airport. It has no restaurant facilities for Black people anywhere. So you have things like bands that are detained and they're given airport vouchers to get meals, and they cannot get meals. And this is something where they actually put more variety of Black people, including, just the people who experience discrimination, put pressure on the federal government that eventually gets all the way to the Truman administration, and creates change. But I think, it's an example of the challenges that you try to put pressure on the corporations, but the corporations are kind of trying to decide whose bottom line they're worried about. And they go along with segregation in things like airports for decades.
But then there's also the example of the chap who, because of expediency, puts on the turban. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh yeah, this is one of the dodges and one of the complexities. Travel is a site of what Thomas Holt calls race making, where people kind of decide who and what you are, and Southern segregation laws apply to Black people. There are some areas in which they might apply to Mexicans, but there's a large class of sort of other brown-skinned people that are exempted. So you have people who will put on a turban and claim to be an Indian prince. You have people who will speak Spanish in Florida in hopes of not being segregated. You have people trying to kind of some people quite routinely trying to kind of get around the experience of segregated transportation by pretending to be something else, including one of the club women. I've forgotten who it was, but one of the very light-skinned club women used to always travel white to her destination and then be met by a black delegation. Deborah Gray White talks about it in her book, Too Heavy a Load. She was just like, I'm not gonna travel in the Jim Crow car. But then when she got off the train, she was always met by a bevy of local black dignitaries.
Thank you. Steve Lipsome has been patiently waiting with a hand up. Steve, unmute yourself and pose your question.
Thank you. Yeah, I first started to think of like comparisons between the travel segregation you talk about and school segregation in terms of timing or rationale, or which forms were most desired by whites or most detested by African Americans, or strategies of fighting them, and just comparing those things. But then I also realized that there actually could be definite intersections between travel segregation and school segregation, be it like Blacks who have to go to segregated schools have to travel farther to get there, or perhaps colleges, or perhaps African Americans might who go to college might choose where to go to college based on like travel issues affecting that choice. So could you talk about whichever of like comparisons or interaction or intersections between travel segregation and school segregation seem most interesting to you to discuss?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think to me, the most striking parallels are the extent to which the fight against school segregation and the fight against travel segregation intersect. And I would just give one example. In the Brown cases, included one group of litigants whose biggest issue was that they didn't have a school bus, and that it was 9 miles, and the white school district, their area would not pay for a school bus for Black kids. Linda Brown, the big issue was crossing dangerous train tracks, taking a long walk to get to school. And then, of course, with busing, sort of the whole issue of transportation and segregation again intersect when busing is sort of fought back as something that's, too difficult, though in fact it often means Black children being bused. So there are these connections, and these connections have to do with this sort of deep links between residential segregation and the problems of transportation that Blacks encounter. I mean, there's definitely elements to traveling Black that go well beyond this, in the sense that there's a kind of national travel picture that African Americans experience, but on a local level, it's about residential segregation and the ways in which certain things are often off limits to African Americans. And we see this today in the ways that towns and municipalities are laid out, and the ways in which some things are accessible and some things are not to particular groups of people.
Thank you. Michael Goodman's hand is up. Please unmute, ask a question.
Yeah, thanks. Another question that occurs to me is I read in some book on the Kennedy administration that someone in the State Department raised a concern that diplomats needing to travel between New York and Washington, or vice versa, sometimes faced segregated facilities in Maryland. And Kennedy was approached about the problem, and he said something rather flippant like, well, why can't they just fly? Is that anecdote actually correct? Thanks.
As far as I know, it's correct. I actually quoted in the book. I talk about the struggle to desegregate that stretch of road between Washington and New York City, which would the route people used to go was Route 40. And you had international incidents along that road in Delaware and Maryland for several decades. Kennedy initially didn't really entirely understand the problem, and his response to it was somewhat flippant, though he eventually authorized people within his administration to actually support ongoing efforts to desegregate that road. with some success. So he would eventually learn, but it was part of his learning curve when it came to fully understanding regional politics.
Thank you. We have a comment from David Sobelson, who writes, did you know that just a few years ago, the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C. had an extensive exhibit called See the USA, about traveling by car around the United States before the interstate highways, an exhibit that nearly completely ignored the experience of Black motorists. The only acknowledgement was a copy of the Green Book on a wall with zero explanation for the artifact, and I eventually got the museum to put up a wall card explaining the need for the Green Book.
I did not know that, and that is quite it should be shocking, but I mean, I think we are just beginning to fully acknowledge that history. I know that the National Parks Association is doing some work on segregation in national parks, but I think that there's a way in which we have this sort of picture of traveling. I mean, just think about it. We talk about the open road. We have this sort of notion of this country as a country that people travel around very freely. And even now, as people begin to talk about the Green Books, one of the things that sometimes irks me is people talk about the Green Book like it was the only such book. I mean, there were so many others, and I list, I don't know, 6 to 8, and I think I saw evidence of others that I couldn't find much on. There were lists kept by musicians, so there was always this sort of challenge of navigating and these kinds of experiences, and this really should not have been neglected in this exhibit.
Mm-hmm. And Stephen Shore just wrote in to say that the old mobile travel guides also listed which hotels and restaurants welcomed Blacks at least through 1965.
Right.
Cornelia Weiss has a question. When did bus drivers stop wearing weapons? Did they have weapons as a means of enforcing segregation?
That's a good question. And I don't know the answer to when they stopped wearing weapons, but they definitely were given police powers in a lot of the state segregation ordinances. So I think that was definitely a connection between that, though they would often, especially by the civil rights movement era, they would often actually call the police to actually enforce it. But that's a legal history. I mean, the book does a lot of legal history, but that is part of the legal history that I don't know. So thank you for that question. I'm going to look into it.
Maria Shin has posed a question for us. This September 25th is the 64th anniversary of the 1957 Little Rock 9 desegregation history of the Southern High School. She's working on a complete history movie project about Little Rock. Although busing policy was not a desegregation issue per se in Little Rock, in your research, did you come across when and how it became an important civil rights strategy?
No, I mean, partially because by the time we get to the busing era, I'm kind of really looking at the sort of dismantling of traditional forms of travel segregation, the dismantling of back of the bus regulations, of the desegregation of trains. So, and the book focuses more on travel per se, traveling from state to state, which is sort of the major locus for protests. So I do not really do much on busing, though I am struck by the extent to which, with things like busing, the intersection between transportation and segregation remains really central even after the civil rights movement.
So I'm going to exercise my chair's prerogative to get a question or two in on my own. I'm wondering if you could talk about how individual passengers who elect to defy segregation and then turn to the court system to either defend themselves or to go on the attack, how they actually go about doing this. And the NAACP is a player sometimes in the book, but not always. And so the NAACP at times is uncomfortable with certain of these cases, and at other times throws itself into this. So if you could talk about the individual challengers and then plaintiffs on the one hand, and then the role of the NAACP on the other.
Absolutely. I mean, the individual travelers, as you know, have a really long history, and they sometimes sort of go at it completely alone in the sense that they don't necessarily have support, but that can always be challenging because they have to pay for the legal case somehow. So many seek support from their community or from early civil rights organizations. That starts even before the NAACP. They seek support from their churches, in some cases their fraternities. And we see this in people like Ida B. Wells, or even before her, Elizabeth Jennings. And sometimes they have their community behind them, sometimes they don't. But with the development of the NAACP, and particularly its legal defense department, it becomes kind of a clearinghouse for a lot of these cases. But the NAACP is always trying to make sure that they pursue, a litigation strategy that they see it is in keeping with their sort of long-term objectives. And some of these cases are not. So by the time you get to the 30s, you have people regularly reporting the indignities they experienced to the NAACP, seeking advice. And they often get advice, and sometimes the advice is just pursue civil litigation. Like, we are not interested, we're not going to take that on. We don't have the resources for it. And that is the problem, especially in the Depression era. The NAACP does not have money to take all the travel cases that they get. And they also are looking for cases that really would undermine Plessy versus Ferguson, or wouldn't at least run the risk of it getting somehow additional support in the courts. So they want a very specific type of case. They also want to, and some of the cases don't even sort of take up transportation. People are sometimes charged with something else. So they have many reasons to sort of pick and choose. But there you have litigants seeking support from other organizations as well, Black fraternities. Some people are self-funded. An important World War II era case by Arthur Wargs Mitchell. He's a congressman. He sort of funds it himself. So people are finding all sorts of ways to support these cases and keep them going. And they're often kind of launching them without even having a sort of plan for how they're going to support them, but then finding a way. I also think there are a lot of cases that sort of collapse. I saw many reports of cases that I just could find no evidence that there was anything that ever got into the court system. But I think what it shows, it's very broad-based. It shows also that the NAACP, for all that it is very ambivalent about making transportation one of its central issues, and sort of understandably so, that the NAACP always thought things like anti-lynching and education were more pressing. It gets pressed over and over again to do more about transportation in ways that will be important to the NAACP really becoming a player in this field. And it underscores that, the NAACP is responding to events on the ground, and that also that ordinary people have sort of stakes in what happens in litigation that they're very much aware of.
Years ago, in the pre-digital era, when I spent vast quantities of time in front of that thing called the microfilm machine, reading the Black press, I was struck time and again by the number of incidents from the 1920s onward, the period that I was looking at, of individuals who at some point say, enough, I am not moving to the back of the bus, leaving the car on the train, or whatever. And there'd be these little write-ups. And you include many such stories, in this book. It also turns out that there are many legal victories. Yes, you mentioned that there are cases that you can't find the outcome of, but there are lots of legal victories in the court system and before the Interstate Commerce Commission. And yet, you also show that for every headline that says, Jim Crow takes a hammering and is about to fall, it doesn't. So if you could say something about the limits of legal achievement in this period. There are a lot of headlines celebrating these cases, and then nothing changes.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the, to me, the striking parts of the story is that you keep having these legal victories that change nothing, or seem to change nothing. Part of it is the Interstate Commerce Commission, which has as its responsibility to adjudicate cases in which people have not sort of gotten what they paid for when they bought a ticket to travel through the states. It will again and again say, well, things really should be, things can be separate but equal, but they should be equal. It will affirm this over and over again, but do nothing about this. So you'll get these victories, including there was one in Texas where they briefly on the train where the victory was celebrated, they briefly took the washcloths out of the white restrooms to make them equal to the black restrooms for a matter of months. This was their response to, okay, well, we're not going to have washcloths anywhere on the train. But in general, the railroads could kind of safely ignore whatever came down from the Interstate Commerce Commission right through until the early 60s, when finally the federal government put some teeth to it. And then also you had Southern state and local governments and the carriers doing things to get around changes. The carriers started to do them by regulations at various points. State and local governments would do segregation by police edict. As long as there was some sense that you could get away with it, segregation would come back very rapidly after a court decision in some form or another. And when you think about it, it's not unlike the ongoing situation we have with education, where technically we're supposed to have a desegregated education system, but we don't really. And the transportation was very much like that. And it took not just court decisions, but also protests, civil disobedience, different kinds of activism to actually create any kind of change. And I think there's kind of a lesson about social change in that, about that we don't get social change that just comes out of the courts. The pressure has to be continuous. And what was the statement of racism being like an informer? There's always a new Cadillac there, that's what we still see, right?
But Mia, don't you think, I'm sorry, Dr. Ray, don't you think that especially in the 1920s and 30s, those kinds of headlines also do other heavy lifting, like keeping up morale, realizing that maybe this one didn't work, but the next one will. And it took a lot of courage to even be, again, to say this small thing of, I am using this bathroom, or I am walking in the front door. Like, those things are not inconsequential. People got killed for less, right? And then I think it also sold papers. When we can't forget that that's also important, right? Especially for the NAACP, which is constantly talking about its membership and et cetera. So having, these big headlines that say
these headlines actually encouraged resistance, they often involve, the details of the case were sometimes not what people were interested in. Like the Mitchell case, which I mentioned, was a case that actually outlawed segregation in Pullman facilities, but it was read by many Blacks during the World War II era as potentially a marker that all desegregation was coming, and people often cited the Mitchell case when they refused to obey segregation. So these cases gave people hope. They also nourished a kind of vernacular legal culture, which was, somewhere at the intersection between what was changing and what people wanted to change, and helped move things along.
Thank you. And unfortunately, I have to draw this to a close, but I will say that when I first started the book, I thought I was going to read a book about a subject I knew a good deal about. And then you disabused me of that notion, and I realized just how little I knew and how much more you found and were able to weave countless stories into a very readable, coherent whole. So this is a book that I would strongly recommend to folks, in American history, in African American history, people interested in the history of civil rights. In addition to being, I think, important historiographically, it's also a very good and moving read. And with that, I want to say thank you to Mia, to Greta, to Sage, and to those of you in the audience. And I would invite you to join us in a handful of days on Thursday, September 23rd at 4 p.m., when we return to discuss Nancy Sherman's Stoic Wisdom, Ancient Lessons for Modern Resilience, and come back on Monday, September 27th, for a discussion with Eric Zoloff on The Last Good Neighbor, Mexico, and the Global 60s. So thank you all. Take care and good night.